All right, so in After Effects, I have my new project. If I want, I can just check my composition settings to make sure that they're what I want them to be. In this case, the HD TV preset, the 1920 by 1080 aspect ratio is fine. I can use square pixels. For my duration, I'm just going to start off at 5 seconds. If I want to increase this, I can just change it to 10 seconds, and I'll hit OK. So last week, we kind of played with the puppet pin tool a little bit, and what that looked like was we were able to kind of take like a basic shape and not only sort of affect the properties that we were used to affecting, like the anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity, but we were also able to kind of make joints for the object. And we did that again by going up here and selecting the puppet pin tool. So once I have this selected, I can sort of kind of place joints on my object and then sort of move them about. And I can animate them just with turning their stopwatch on and off and keyframing the movement. And we also looked at using the starch tool to kind of starch areas that we didn't want to be so bendy. Like this is kind of bending very freely. If I wanted to kind of sort of prevent that bend from being so free, maybe give it a more realistic sort of look, I could add some starch to it, and then that would change the sort of bending. So kind of a more complicated example would be taking a figure or some other illustration that we drew, usually in Illustrator, and putting that in. So we'll just go through a kind of an example of how to do that. Actually, maybe I'll do the night. So in Illustrator, I'm going to open up these two illustrations that I have. So one is this wizard that we kind of looked at last week, and then the other one is this. The one I'm going to work with today is this knight, right? And so you can see that I have the knight kind of just as a separate layer. So when I import him, I think I'm going to import him as kind of, so what I'm going to do with the puppet pin tool is try to get him to walk and move his arms with the sword and the shield. And I'm going to kind of import him as separate layers to do that. So I'm going to try to isolate the layers that I want. So for this first kind of layer that I'm going to animate, I probably just want to bring in, I could probably do a puppet pin on this area of him and be okay. I don't want to bring in this arm with this sword because it's a little bit more complicated of a shape. And I want to be able to move that kind of more independently. So I'm just going to bring in this knight as one layer with the arm, the head, the torso, and the legs. So I'll just call this knight top. And I'll save it on my desktop. So again, what I wanted to do was kind of isolate the layers that I could move easily with the puppet pin tool. And that turned out to be the this arm and then the rest of his body. And I'm saving the other arm to kind of animate independently. So I can bring this into After Effects. And here I have my knight. And if I needed to kind of access the individual layers, they're in that folder. So I can just bring this into my composition. So here, now I can start placing my joints. So with my puppet pin tool selected, I can start placing my joints on this knight. Generally, the way that you approach this is to kind of almost rig up a skeleton, and this will become more pronounced when we go into 3D, because the only way to sort of animate 3D objects is by rigging up this skeleton. So usually you place the first joint in like the area that is most stable, and for human, kind of humanoid figures, that happens to be kind of in the groin area, which is always comical, but that's kind of where that sort of joint happens to be. And then you can go up and put another joint in the chest, another one at the base of the neck, and then another one at the top of the head. And then you kind of want to rig up the arms. So this elbow joint would have kind of some movement, so we'll put a joint there, we'll put a joint there, and then we'll put a joint maybe where the wrist would be. And then we can begin to rig up the legs. So we'll put a joint here, kind of at the knee, and this figure makes it a little bit easy because the armor kind of articulates where the movement will be. And then we'll put another one there, and we'll do the same to the other leg. So now if we were to move these things, we kind of have this articulated skeleton now, right? So what I want to do is kind of make him walk. So the first thing I'm going to do is maybe move the entire figure over to one side of the screen so I can have him walk across the screen. So I'm going to go into my transform properties and just move the X horizontal position. To the other side of the screen. He's a little big for what I want, so I can also change his scale from 100 to like 90%. Maybe even a little more. I'll go to 80. And then I'll just start doing my animations. So with the puppet pin, you want to make sure that your playhead for your timeline is at the beginning. A lot of times people kind of make a mistake where they have their playhead somewhere over here and then start their animation, and it obviously doesn't look right because After Effects is only starting the transformation from where you have the playhead. So I'll go there. So I'll just make sure that my playhead is at the beginning of the timeline. And then I'll just begin to animate kind of the pins that I want. So if I select that, it'll tell me which pin it is. I can also rename these. Sometimes people find it super helpful to kind of rename where these puppet pin or what these pins actually are. So So I can rename that one center. I'm actually going to take the time to do that because it's will save me some time later. I'll call that one chest. I'll call this one neck. So I'm just labeling them to make it easier for me to kind of find them later. Top of head. Like when you have like kind of a fully articulated skeleton, it's really easy to get confused as to which joints you're working with. So sometimes relabeling them helps. Shoulder. Elbow. Wrist. So it's taking me a little bit of time now, but I'll be much more organized at the end. Oops, that was the right knee. So now that they're all labeled, I know exactly kind of which joint that I am moving. So now I can kind of start my walking animation. So for that, I'm probably going to start maybe with this leg that he's sort of moving up. So I'll make sure that I'm on the right knee. I'll bring my timeline down to 15 frames, just sort of lift that up. So I'm going to do my animation first and then kind of use the starch tool later. So if I think about how someone walks, they would like lift their foot up first and then put it down and then lift the other foot, right? So I can bring this back down. And lift the other. That one's really bad there with the deformity. So we'll have to fix that. So I'm just moving these joints, how kind of I would make somebody walk. And then I could also move his position so that as that's happening, he could also kind of move across the screen. So I'm going to try to coordinate it to move him there. So the legs are still really distorted, but you get the idea, and we can kind of fix that when we go in with our starch tool. So now with my starch tool, I can kind of go in and fix where that leg is sort of distorting. So I can think about like what parts of a leg would sort of really move and look at how it's distorting. So when I see this, I think it kind of needs starch all through here, because that wouldn't really move so much. I'm going to try to turn down, maybe turn up the extent of my starch. I'll make it fairly stiff at like 70%. So this movement on the right leg looks okay, but it does get a little distorted here. So that's looking better. And then on this guy, I kind of want to put starch all along this kind of area because it gets a little too distorted there. And maybe some on the thigh. All right. So I kind of have him walking. I'll do one more and just kind of have him walk to the center of the screen. So you're basically what you're doing is kind of distorting your figure or your mesh so that it kind of looks like he's walking. And you can really play around with the starch tool to kind of stiffen up the parts that don't look as realistic. In this case, that kind of movement that's happening with this like tunic he's wearing actually looks pretty good. So I would just keep that. And then maybe once he gets to the sort of middle of the screen, he'll lower his arm. So I can go into those joints. And since I labeled them all, they're easy to find. So I want him to kind of lower his arm. So it gets all bendy there. If I want to, I can just take my starch tool and kind of starch up that area that's bending so that it's stiffer and it doesn't have that unnatural, like people's arms don't bend that way, right? So now it looks like a more natural movement. I probably want to put some starch kind of up here too. Oops. So this process obviously takes some time as we're kind of discussing workflow. And I did not have the, I didn't have my keyframes on for that. So I'm going to have to turn them on. I'm just going to copy the beginning keyframes and put them kind of right where I want the animation with his arm to start. Because I don't want the motion of his arm to start at the beginning of the timeline. I want it to just sort of happen when he gets to where he's going. So probably right around here. Then I can kind of pull down. And I'll add some starch. Starch is kind of like your best friend when you're doing this because it helps those movements that don't look super natural sort of become a little bit more natural. I'm going to add some here on the elbow just to sort of restrain the movement of that joint. And I don't want this to be so long. It looks a little weird getting long like that. So with the puppet pin tool, you really want to avoid that kind of like spaghetti, like boneless movement. You want to really think about where resistance will be. And then here, I can kind of bring in his shield. See if I have it on a layer. If not, I'm going to have to create a separate file for it. So I'm going to drag in his shield as a separate layer on the top. And I'll just have that kind of follow my knight. So I'll make the scale smaller because I made the whole knight smaller. And I'll change the position of the shield to sort of be where I want it to be. And I'll just have it follow my knight. And then here's where he starts kind of lowering his arm. So I can lower my shield sort of the same way. And I maybe want to curve it a little bit different. Like, let's say he's like lowering his shield to stop this attack or something. I'd want that shield to be more at his body. So I'm going to kind of do this to it. I'm going to just kind of change the rotation on that so it makes a little bit more sense. So the idea here is to kind of use these tools to sort of mimic kind of different things that you would kind of see in real life. So now that I've sort of jointed up this guy, I can bring in his arm. So remember in my Illustrator file, I sort of left his arm off because I wanted to animate only those parts of him as a separate layer. So I'm just going to do the opposite and bring in his arm and that sword. That. So I kind of just want to bring in this. Oops. And now in After Effects, I can bring in that layer. Put it in my documents by accident. Where did I put it? Let me try copying these layers and pasting them to a new file. So now I have the sword arm that I can animate. I'll have to scale it down, obviously, unless he's like a crazy kind of crab sort of knight. And I'll just put it where it kind of needs to be. And then I can kind of animate the position. So it's a little weird there. Let me try to get that exactly. But here it kind of comes to a stop, so I'll put it right there. And then I could put some joints in this shape too. So I'll go to my puppet pin tool. I'll make sure I have the knight sword arm selected. I'll put a joint here. And I'll kind of animate this as he's walking. So let me just get to my mesh, deform. I'm not gonna, for time's sake, I'm not gonna label these, but it's good practice too. So maybe I just kind of want this, see, I'm already confused about which joint I want. So I'll have that there. And then as he's walking, the sword can just kind of move up and down. Kind of like imitating how, you know, your arm would kind of sway if you were walking. So kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to go a little bit faster than I normally would. And then maybe there, I want that arm to totally raise up like he's like about to fight something, right? So it's probably a little too fast here, so I can kind of separate those keyframes a little bit. I'll just kind of move them out a little farther from one another so that that's not going so fast. I can probably even delete a few. And then kind of the big issue that I see is his arm is a little spaghetti-like, right? So I want to just put some starch where I kind of don't want his arm to move. So I see kind of when I look at this that deformity is really happening on the inside curve. So I'll just put some starch on these inside parts of his arm. And he probably needs some on the outside too. Because that arm is kind of looks really stretchy. So that looks better. Here I'm just maybe gonna move this up a little bit because it looks a little strange. And then you could always kind of put a background on this. For time's sake, I'm going to, wait, I think I had one actually. Hold on. So I have this castle scene that I can bring in. I hit iBooks by accident. Ignore that. Where did the castle go? I'll bring this guy in. And I can use this castle as a background. I'll just stretch it out. He's kind of floating there in space, so I'm gonna change the position. So I find an easy way to do this is to select all of the positions of all the objects that you're moving. So in this case, I'm moving the shield, the arm, and the sword as separate elements. And I can just bring their positions down all at once. And that should just change all of the positions.
Are you selecting everything?
You just shift select. And then kind of a neat trick that I see people do sometimes with backgrounds is they make their background bigger than it needs to be. And then they kind of keyframe the position on that. So as he's kind of moving, you can sort of have the background move with him. So it sort of looks like he's walking. And it should stop right there. If you matched it up right, so it would stop like over here somewhere. All right, so what I'd like you to do is draw a quick figure in Illustrator. We have about 45 minutes left in class, but draw a quick kind of humanoid figure in Illustrator, bring it into After Effects, and try to make it walk across the screen using the puppet pin tool.